Hello, I'm going to show you how I did the Dynam Corsair flap mod. In this tutorial I'm going to use multiple pictures and I'll explain what I did in each picture. First, I lay down a towel on the table so that my wing would not get damaged due to dry glued spots or tools, cords, whatever. So this is what I did. On the top of the right wing, I had to mark about 3/4 of an inch on the trailing edge where I was going to cut the flap to where I was going to start cutting. You don't want to cut all the way to the wing root where the left arrow is, just to where the right arrow is. Again, it's about 3/4 of an inch. So you want to start cutting from where the hobby knife is, again that's 3/4 of an inch, all the way over to where the start of the aileron is on the left side. This picture here, I'm pulling out the trailing edge where I cut to show you how far I did cut and what it should look like. Now notice my line isn't 100% straight. It doesn't need to be straight. We'll go ahead and sand that up so it is straight. Now I'll go ahead and flip the wing over, and here I'll cut the rest of the flap out by the fuselage. So again, the wing is upside down and I'm going to cut the rest of the flap off. This picture here shows what the flap will look like once it's cut out. In the next three pictures I'm showing sanding up the trailing edge of the wing and the leading edge of the flap along with the sides of the flap. In these next pictures I'm going to show you how to cut the flaps into sections. We'll use the line where the red arrows are as a guide to cut the flap. Okay, so use your ruler, lay it down on the line, and then where the flap is, you can take your razor blade and just go ahead and cut the flap section right along with the ruler. Here you can see the line where I sliced the flap. The inboard flap is on the left and the middle flap is on the right. Next, we're going to have to cut part of the aileron to form the outboard portion of the flap. Here I am marking with my hobby knife the bottom of the aileron, which line needs to be cut. So just please make note of which line needs to be sliced there before you cut. The outboard aileron is now cut. Notice you have 4 panels on the outboard flap that make up the flap itself, which separates it from the aileron. Here you can see the marks on the trailing edge of the wing. Basically what I'm doing here is marking the center of the trailing edge to install the flaps. So I'm going to be slicing these areas for the flap. Here I'm holding the inboard flap, and if you notice the line on the center portion of the inboard flap that I drew, I am marking the center. I'm going to use this for 2 references. 1 for cutting the hinge line, and 2 for beveling the surface. You will want to mark the center of all the control surfaces because some of them will be installing inserts, and I'll show you later what we'll be doing. Here I marked a sign line on the inboard flap so that you can bevel the flap so it will hinge and bend on the wing. The inboard flap is now beveled. Next, I went ahead and slotted the inboard flap for the CA hinges. Just note that I'm also using thin CA. Also note the location where I'm putting the hinges. Now I'm slotting the trailing edge of the wing to fit the hinges in place. However, we don't want to glue any of the hinges in until after all the parts have been test fitted and function properly. Okay, right now I'm holding the middle flap, and basically we're going to somewhat repeat the steps of the inboard flap on the middle flap. However, we're going to put the hinge locations in a little different spot. Want to be very careful because if we put the hinges in the wrong spot, then the flap will lock over center and it won't function like. Here is a picture of the inboard flap beveled, and right now I'm slotting it for the hinges. Note where I mounted the hinges on the middle flap. One's on the right side of the flap and the other one is in the middle of the flap, just before the bend upward. If you put both hinges on both ends of the flap, then the flap will walk over center and it will not work the way it should. Here we are looking at the trailing edge of the wing. I went ahead and marked where we need to cut in order to slide the hinges in. The reason why the cut is so long is when we slide the middle flap in place, it's going to have to go in at an angle with the tabs in place on each side of the flap in order for all three flaps to work. So this cut needs to be as long as it is. Just make a note of that. Next, I went ahead and I just installed the inboard flap and the middle flap in place. However, I have not glued anything yet. I'm just test fitting, making sure that the flaps are in the location where I want them to be. Here I cut out two tabs that will be inserted into the middle flap, which will connect the inboard and outboard flaps to the middle flap. The size of these tabs for the middle flap section, they are 1.5 inches long by 1 inch wide. These tabs are made from materials I had on hand. I'm using a hotel key for the outboard to middle section to connect the two halves together, and then for the inboard to the middle span I'm using Lexan, which is 0.03 inches thick. The reason why I'm using Lexan for the inboard to middle flap is the Lexan tends to be more flexible and almost as rigid as what the credit card is, but I need the flexibility for the inboard to middle flap. I sliced the middle flap on both ends. On the right side I'm going to put the hotel key, and on the left side I'm going to put the Lexan. So basically the Lexan will connect the middle flap and the inboard flap together, and the hotel key will connect the outboard flap and the middle flap section together. You can note where I glued the tabs into the middle flap. They're almost like right in the middle on both ends. However, on the inboard and outboard flaps, you'll go ahead and slice it, and slice it a little wide so that the flaps have room to move from the tabs. The tabs will be fixed in place on the middle section, but the outboards, they will not be glued and they'll be able to move freely. Okay, I connected the inboard and the middle flaps together with the tabs, and now I have to slide the inboard and middle flap in at an angle to connect into the outboard flap, as you see here in this picture. Again, we'll just go ahead and slide everything in place, but don't glue anything yet until it's all been test fitted. Again, I flipped the wing over so I can go ahead and test fit the flaps. Again, I'm not going to glue the flaps in place until I can see exactly how everything is working. So I did that, and once I have test fit and make sure everything's working the way I want it to, then just I grabbed some CA, some thin CA that is, and I glued the hinges in place. The last couple steps are to install the Dubro micro hinge for the flaps and installing the servo. The Dubro micro hinge that I chose had two prongs that glued into the foam. The reason why I chose the location for the flap servo was, for one, Dynam had already had the insert pre-cut for the servo, and two, the holes were already pre-drilled in the aileron for the control horn, with which the flap control horn is now installed. One recommendation I would do for the second time is, if I were to install flaps again, I would use 9 gram or 12 gram metal geared servos versus the 9 gram servos I'm using now. They tend to have a little bit more push, but these will work just fine. Now that I was satisfied with my flaps, I went ahead and just painted the bottom of my wing, so here it is.